Hey sports fans, Coach Nick here, and welcome to B-Ball Breakdown. We have a very special chat with our guest, Rob Mahoney, who writes across the spectrum, in the New York Times being one of them. And check out his article today talking about how Dwayne Wade has been integral to the Miami Heat, perhaps in ways you haven't noticed. Rob, thanks for joining us, and let's talk a little bit about the Miami Heat and the Knicks in that series, since we just wrote that article today.
It's been pretty predictable so far. I think, the Heat are just on a different level than this Knicks team, and especially with the injuries they've suffered. Zach Lowe over at the Point Forward at Sports Illustrated wrote that, the Knicks really have kind of reached a critical point with their injuries where it's just injury on injury on injury on injury, and there's definite truth to that. When you look at, if Jeremy Lin were the only one injured, I think it'd be a much different situation, but you've got Baron Davis, dinged up, you've got Jared Jeffries nursing an injury, now you've got Iman Shumpert out for the rest of the season. It's so difficult for them, especially against such an effective defense, to really get anything going offensively.
Especially because the vulnerabilities of the Heat are, point guard and center, and when they don't have a point guard that's, healthy enough to attack, it's not a great recipe for success. And then when you throw in the fact that you have the glass hole, Amari Stoudemire hurting his hand, do you have any insight into that? Because I think they must understand to some degree what you just described, and yet his reaction as if they should have won that game and then smash his hand is a little strange to me.
Well, you have to understand that pretty much every NBA team is in this situation where even if they're outmatched, they feel like they should have a fight in a series. They feel like they're good enough to at least compete. And I thought in Game 2 they did a much better job, as the scoring margin indicates, than they did in Game 1. But at the same time, maybe that's what they found frustrating, that this game was much more attainable than Game 1 was, and they had a few more strategic counters to get Carmelo Anthony going, and it just still didn't work out. That said, I don't think many people really realistically predicted the Knicks to put up that much of a fight in this series. So yeah, the fact that Amari decided to take out his frustrations on a fire hydrant, or on a fire extinguisher, is a little silly.
Now, we did a breakdown showing how they were fronting Melo in the post and how that kind of stymied the entire Knick offense. And I don't know if you've seen it, but certainly what were the adjustments that you saw that the Knicks made to get Melo better shots?
Some of it really was as simple as getting the ball on the perimeter and letting him initiate the offense, whether it's in the pick and roll or just off the dribble. But I think the much more impressive play action was hitting him in stride on cuts. And if that's something that the Knicks can do, it's really easy. You just have to get Carmelo Anthony in motion rather than trying to establish him on the block every time down the floor. And so, I think that's a much more effective strategy for them than trying to have him initiate every offensive set, even considering their limitations at point guard right now. And it's going to come down to Mike Woodson adding some creativity into their offensive motion.
And it's funny because it's a pretty simple adjustment, and we were showing how they were just cross-screening from him starting in the corner to get to the post. That worked well. That wouldn't have been hard to do for the second half of Game 1, and yet they never seemed to grasp that. And then in Game 2, they were better. But in my mind as a coach, I would feel like if they're going to front and he's going to be near the elbow, they just need to hit the weak side high post and let him cut to the basket. They get layups. They would have to stop fronting him. And yet that doesn't seem to be there on a quick hitter. And so as a result, the Knicks are having a hard time getting good shots.
Yeah, it's one of those things where Mike Woodson, he gets a lot of flack for what happened in Atlanta. I don't think he's a bad coach by any means. I think he's done really good work with New York's defense thus far this season. I almost wonder if maybe he gave up on Game 1 and didn't want to show, what their counters would be going into Game 2, especially just because of the way the second quarter and the third quarter went. Otherwise, you have to think that any NBA coach would be ready for that kind of action and ready with some kind of counter. And I give Woodson a little more credit than that. Otherwise, I'm baffled as to why there was no adjustment in the second half of Game 1.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a fair point, because these are long series in theory. So perhaps they might be able to turn that around in New York. Let's shift a little bit now that we're talking about coaching to the Dallas and Oklahoma City series, because without question, when you watch what Rick Carlisle is doing out there, that has to be a real significant part of what's keeping Dallas so close and just about taking both those games.
And Rick Carlisle is a fantastic coach. I think he has a lot of pressure on him now with the way that Oklahoma City is playing Jason Terry. They're really aggressively almost fronting him as well, denying him the ball in a lot of instances. And the Dallas offense is going to have to get him open. He was so great in the first half of Game 1. But really hasn't been a factor since. And it's going to be on Carlisle and on Dallas's screeners to really get him some shots. We saw some kind of basic backdoor action from Terry in Game 2, and I'm hoping we'll see more of that going forward.
Were you surprised going through down the stretch in Game 1 of the turnovers that Dirk committed?
It's something that you don't see all that often, but I mean, honestly, it was just Oklahoma City was bringing extra defenders, and James Harden hit great hands on a couple of those plays, just managed to get a deflection here and there. Kendrick Perkins did a good job. It's one of those things where Dirk is such a great late game performer and does so great in isolation of those situations, but he's not invulnerable to these kinds of things, especially when that help comes. Putting him at the top of the floor really helps in terms of cutting off double team angles, but at the same time, he's still going to be vulnerable to that at times.
And I thought that sometimes there's no replacement for good old fashioned post up down low or in the mid post, and I thought they got a little too creative for themselves by having him up on top, and he tried to drive to his left, which he's got a good left, and he does go left, but when you're going toward the middle from the right side to left, I think 2 of those turnovers were the same way where he was going that way. And I think against the Thunder, who are so quick and so long, you have to go to what to limit the exposure he might have on the dribble to the basket.
I mean, Rick Carlisle and the Mavs have been big on what they call their flow offense, which is basically it's based on very simple principles, and basically they just let Jason Kidd orchestrate them and run the show, and it works really effectively most of the time. The problem is when you get in those situations and you're asking them to kind of create these plays for themselves on the fly, it is very different than if you had a more concrete set, even if it's a flex set with multiple options. And so, I mean, you saw that in Game 2 that the Mavs, rather than go on that right side, they established Dirk at the left elbow, where it's something we saw a lot last year in the NBA Finals, where he was able to drive by Chris Bosh and Udonis Haslem and a lot of guys in that situation. I think we're going to see more of Dirk at the left elbow going forward, and as well as those deep block areas.
And absolutely. That's where he'll do most of his damage. And I wouldn't screw around anymore if I were Rick Carlisle, because it clearly. And by the way, here's what should make Dallas fans feel good about themselves, is that in the face of all of that, the Game 1 game came down to a ridiculously lucky shot, which Durant himself said he couldn't see the rim. And he didn't follow through. He got hit on the arm. They're not going to call that. So it's like, I don't know what you got to do, what else you have to do. That's exactly what Dallas did all last year. It's just enough to keep him there and then take it at the end. And then in the last game, it sounded like the entire stadium fell out of their chairs when Dirk Nowitzki got that, did a screen and roll and flared to the 3-point line and didn't make that 3. And uncharacteristically lost a bigger lead. I'm sorry, the bigger lead was in Game 1. So can you imagine? Are you going to foresee this game going any shorter than about 7 games?
I mean, it's hard to say just because these games have been so close, and it's kind of what we've seen in the past with the Mavericks when they've played the San Antonio Spurs, and you see some series that maybe only go 5 or 6 games despite every game being within 3 or 4 points. And it's something we saw last year too with the Chicago Bulls and the Indiana Pacers in the first round, where I mean, if the games are that hard fought and the breaks just keep going one way or another, I mean, it's conceivable this thing could be over in 5 if Dallas just has that bad of a string of luck.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I hear you. I have to imagine they'll shoot better at home and they'll have that crowd. And you're right. These games could all go down to the wire and it could be a sweep. But as far as I'm concerned, I know Dallas is going to get back in this series. I can't imagine they won't. OKC has too much of a turnover issue that will keep them from separating. Well, let's move on to our third and last series we'll talk about today, which would be the Clippers and the Grizzlies. And we had an epic meltdown or an epic comeback, depending on which part of the country you're from. Did you get a chance to see that game?
I did, and I mean, that comeback was such an unbelievable force of nature. Just Chris Paul putting on a show, and it's at the time where the Clippers have to be very thankful they traded for a guy like Nick Young, just especially with Caron Butler going down with injury. I mean, they're going to be in a tough spot going forward. But the fact that Young is on the roster, I think, can help them a lot offensively. Just because I wrote this yesterday for Bleacher Report's Core Division blog, I just feel like Young is such a better fit alongside Chris Paul, just because he's a catch and shoot guy. He's not going to dilly around with jab steps and pump fakes. He wants to fire all the time. I think he could be fit for their offense over more minutes.
Well, I have to say that statement is half right. He likes to fire. But I've seen him enough this year, and I know him from even off-season workouts. He will jab step and dribble in place and take his time to get that shot up as well. And so I feel like he's going to be hit or miss when he really helps. Now, if he can just sprint to the corner and let Chris Paul hit him there and catch and shoot, my goodness, that's great for him. Or catch and shoot shot, they can go one dribble pull-up. That's perfect, but we'll have to see if he can sustain that. What did you see from from Memphis' side that led to this epic fourth quarter drop?
It's really strange because as much as they built up their lead with three-pointers, down the stretch, I mean, they were going inside as much as anything else. I mean, they were staying true to the more sustainable principles of their offense. The shots just weren't going. They were a little hesitant. Maybe they were trying to milk too much time off the clock and weren't as aggressive as they should have been. So weird though going back through the tape. I mean, I didn't think there were any glaring problems that led to it. It was just such a horrid string of offense. And honestly, with the Grizzlies, that's one of the things that they just have to be able to weather and sustain themselves through. Because even with Zach Randolph and Rudy Gay, and they have a lot of talented offensive pieces, that team goes through some pretty bad cold stretches.
Well, I'll point to a couple stats for you that stood out in my mind. That was in the first quarter when they took the huge lead. Marc Gasol was 5 for 6 from the field, getting his normal easy shots. And after that, he literally ended up. I think he had one shot in the second half, and then none in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, I mean, Marc Gasol is such an important part of their offense, but he's the guy who often gets left out, especially now that Gay and Randolph are both in the mix. And, OJ Mayo is a guy who's going to get shots one way or another. And Gasol, it's sad because he's so talented and he's so good from so many spots on the floor. But he's also such a willing passer that at times he defers a little bit too much maybe, or he's not in the right places to score because he's trying to establish a guy like Randolph or a guy like Gay.
Yeah, and I think that's the Lionel Hollins issue. He needs to get in there in a timeout or whatever and call that play and make sure that he gets it on either the right or left block where he loves it and run it through him more. Otherwise, the Clippers are going to stay in this series. I actually believe that whoever wins Memphis, San Antonio Spurs in the second round is going to get to the finals. Do you have any comment on that?
I mean, I don't disagree. I have a lot more faith in the Spurs than I do the Grizzlies. But I think the Thunder are a really talented team. They're very capable. I mean, they are elite by pretty much any standard. I just like the Spurs a little bit more. I think if you have an Oklahoma City and Memphis Western Conference Finals, I could see the Thunder breaking through. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Spurs could topple the Thunder in the Western Conference Finals.
Well, this was a great conversation. I hope we can come back soon and we can talk about the other series because there's lots of information we can disperse. And next time, maybe we'll argue about something.
That'd be nice. I mean, with these, you have to get some debate in the mix, right?
Absolutely. So great stuff. And everyone check him out. And we will see you next time on B-Ball Breakdown. And don't forget, it's not a channel. It's a conversation. Are you in? Are you in, Rob?
Maybe a little bit.